defining the argument, and by the definition of their terms for science, of course, see, they say science has to be observable, testable, demonstrable, and that's going to automatically exclude God. Well, if that's your, they've set up the parameters where it's a no-win situation for the creationist. I think that we have the same situation for those who teach evolution. They believe in the existence of all sorts of things. They believe there are beneficial mutations, though nobody's ever proven one. They believe an animal can produce a different kind of animal, though nobody's ever observed one. It's not part of science. I cannot scientifically prove the existence of God. I can tell you he changed my life a whole lot 31 years ago. Anybody else in that boat? Yeah. There's my evidence right there. Changed lives. He can make the prostitute pure, make the drunkard sober, and make the liar quit lying. He can do amazing things.
I would like to remind Mr. Oven that this is a scientific debate. We're not in a church. If you want to do something like this in a church, it'll be fine. What was the original question?
Dr. Hovind's argument.
Time for me.
Dr. Hovind's argument would be nullified if it could be conclusively proven that God does not exist. Please address the existence of God from a purely scientific perspective.
Right. Well, as I said, the existence of God, I mean, so on this one, Mr. Owen is definitely correct. The existence of God is not a scientific question, not because that doesn't mean that science excludes, I mean, the interpretation is science excludes anything that you cannot analyze. That's a fallacy, and that's a fallacy that plays in his field, but it's completely untrue, and I don't see why he insists in making it. The fact that something cannot be analyzed scientifically doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay? Our science, as far as I know, cannot analyze why certain people are so fond of the Three Stooges. Does that mean that there are no people out there that are fond of the Three Stooges? Of course not. Science cannot tell me, at this point at least, why is it that I'm so fond of Monty Python. But then, nevertheless, that doesn't negate that fact. So the fact that there are things that are outside of science, it's not equivalent to say that those things don't exist. On the other hand, I will call again on Hume's dictum. You're making a very extraordinary claim, so where's the evidence? Not scientific, but what kind of evidence do you have at all?
Can any known organism be traced back all the way to one cell?
Yeah, you were born that way. Whoever answered that question. The process of development is not well understood. That is one of the other things. There's a large number of academic journals on people working on developmental biology. Developmental biology is something that we know a lot about, but we know an awful lot. There is an awful lot that we don't know about. But nevertheless, you can observe the development of anything from one cell. In fact, everything develops from one cell. Now, in historical times, how would that happen? Well, I don't see what the problem is there. I mean, if you can see it under your nose over the span of a few hours or the span of a few weeks, I don't see what the problem would be over the spans of millions of years. All you need is, for example, a unicellular cell originally that has a mutation and duplicates that cell without then separating them. Now you have a multicellular organism, a two-cellular organism. Okay? If that gets inherited because of the mutation was heritable, then you now have multicellular organisms. It's not that simple. I'm simplifying the situation here, but I don't see any conceptual problem with that kind of thing. Incidentally, this duplication or addition of information, I did say that polyploidy duplicates information. Then mutations come in and they change that information, which means that when you add together the process of polyploidy, which is chromosomal duplication, plus mutations, you have actually created new information, contrary to what you just said.
Okay. You mentioned, read the question one more time so I get to phrase it right. I hate to keep doing this to you, but this is my point-by-point argument again. Let's go point-by-point next time.
I'm sorry, just... Can any known organism be traced back all the way to one cell?
Can any known organism trace back all the way to one cell? If you mean as far as evidence that it evolved from a one-celled creature, absolutely not. What he gave was a far cry from an example of evolution. The human being starts off as one cell and becomes a man. That is because it's following a genetic code. If that's your example of evolution, you're either confused about what evolution is, or you're trying to, again, grossly oversimplify this process. Everything comes from one cell. That is because there's a code it's following, and there's an enormous intake of energy. To get my son from one cell to 22 years old and 6 foot tall took a huge amount of food. There was energy put into this thing. So that is not evolution. If you're teaching your students that that's an example, going from one cell to a fully grown human, that's an example of evolution, you're deceiving your students because it's following a complex genetic code and it is taking in information from the outside. That is not an example of evolution like taught in the textbooks. And by the way, where are the two-celled creatures in the world? It would have to go, there are millions, zillions of one-celled creatures. Where are the two-celled or the three-celled or the four-celled? They don't exist, folks, and he ought to know that. They don't exist. There are colonies that get together and do functions, Volvox and stuff like that, but that's a colony of cells. Each one is still an individual cell. That's not anything similar to a tissue or an organ, and there just aren't any. Evolution falls flat. And you talk about Hume's dictum. You're claiming that all life forms came from one cell. You better have some extraordinary evidence of that.
What about divinely inspired evolution?
What about what?
Divinely inspired evolution.
Divinely inspired evolution. I would say that would be a retarded God that has to use evolution. First place, there's no evidence for evolution anyway, so why should I compromise a perfectly good Bible which has never been proven wrong with a dumb theory which has never been proven right? I wouldn't want to make that trade-off. And plus, I would not worship a God that has to use suffering and misfits and death and blind chance and doesn't know what he wants. The God that I worship made it right first time. No mistakes.
You said that your son grew up thanks to a lot of energy. Doesn't that violate the second principle of thermodynamics? Shouldn't have been annihilated by the energy coming in? Now, that was a joke. Thank you. Okay, the question was about what?
The question simply said, what about
it's fine, by the way.
Divinely
you should try one of these days.
What about divinely inspired evolution?
Divinely inspired evolution. Well, I don't know, but you sure could be. Yeah, you can make the argument that that kind of God would be fairly wasteful. But then again, you know, who are we to make the argument about God's wastefulness or not? I think that was one of your objections before. So maybe we don't know. Maybe that is the best way that God can make things, and that's the way it happened. I have no idea. Again, evolution's got nothing to do, evolutionary biologists have nothing to say about theology. If you want to believe it that way, that's fine. There's plenty of evolutionary biologists. There's a colleague of mine, Dr. Miller at Brown University, who believes exactly that. He's written a book, if you're interested in that, called Finding Darwin's God or something like that. And that's the theory that he proposes. That's fine, but that you should know, reading the book, that that's not evolutionary biology. That's his version of theology. Maybe right or not.
Dr. Pagliucci, why do animals and humans not evolve today?
They do. I tried to explain it several times. Yes, they do. Animals and humans change their genetic constitutions all the time, every day. Therefore, they are evolving by definition. Now, the question might be, why is it that we don't see species appearing every time, every day? That's a good question. The answer to that is because the speciation process is actually pretty slow, as Darwin did propose. But as I said before, we have observed historical events of speciation, so that's not a problem for evolutionary theory either. And incidentally, talking about Darwin and quoting in a, shall we say, a selective way, that passage from Darwin, from The Origin of Species, that said it may seem absurd that to believe that the eye evolved by natural means. You should have smelled a rat there. The word was, it may seem absurd. You should know that if you go and check that quote, immediately afterwards, Darwin goes on into half a chapter in which he tries to explain how, in fact, the eye evolved. So he says, you know, at first view, it might seem like an absurd thing, but here it is how